This is Closereads,
a philosophy podcast with Mark and Wes.
I'm Wes Alwan.
And I'm Mark Linsenmeyer. We are continuing a partially examined life thread from our second full discussion of Max Scheler. In his discussion of love and hate, which is going to be episode 365, in both throughout that whole book on sympathy, he had referred a lot to this earlier tome called Formalism and Ethics and Non-formal Ethics of Values, which I see was released in two chunks in 1913 and 1916. I wanted to get more of an idea of what this notion of personality that he kept referring to, that we only have deep fellow feeling or love for someone. We're contacting their inner core, their personality. And there seemed to be a theory behind that. It's not just like the Christian soul, although maybe it has something to do with that. But in any case, the whole second half of the book, so I assume this is the 1916 half, has to do with that. So starting on chapter 6, Formalism and Person. Yeah, any sort of intro, we want to give it an intro to this, and we'll have the ad break. Do you want to connect us up, fill in where you saw the gap, or did you not see the gap in what we discussed?
The gap in. Sorry, explain why you think there's a gap.
Well, we were discussing. It seemed like so much of his theory in the sympathy thing had to do with this notion of a personality, that I was just describing that as sort of a black box theoretically, because we had not read the text in which he actually explained what this is, and he just says, go look at my other book. And so, though we're not going to do a whole other Scheler episode, certainly it seemed having some close reads on some part of this, and see if we can get, I guess, just right, formalism. Did you get the idea of what a formal ethics and a non-formal ethics is? Do you have? I read.
It sounds like he's going to be thinking of Kant as formal.
Yes.
Deontological. So, and Kant, as we said in our Scheler episode, is focused on the concept of respect, or treating people as ends in themselves, acting according to our obligations towards them out of a sense of duty, respecting rights. By contrast, a sentimentalist like Hume made, and other sympathizers, really, contemporary sympathizers might want to say that morality shouldn't be devoid of this emotional component, like it can't be explained without it, but also it's a bit weird or objectionable to think of morality as involving something purely impersonal and cold and devoid of emotion. And then one of the other alternatives is virtue ethics or eudaimonism, in which we emphasize the role of happiness. But as we saw with Scheler, he seems to be focused. He seems to have I suspect will be a kind of analogy to Kant, but he wants to replace respect with love. So it's still about and love in some higher sense. So we'll have to figure out what that means. It's obviously we can't in any significant concrete sense love people we don't know. So what is the sense, but if this is going to ground morality, then we have to cash out some sense of love, which is more universally applicable. And as we know, there are lots of philosophers who have not liked that idea and thought it's a bit ridiculous. So the idea of love thy neighbor, it's easy to say it, but is it realistic to ask it and to suppose that morality can be based on it?
Right. So we're kind of looking at the same conflict we had read on this podcast, Hegel comparing Judaism and the Sermon on the Mount, early teachings of Christianity, and seemed to be thinking that Judaism was like Kant, a little more about the rules, about not necessarily focusing on the specifics of the person that you are loving, the person that you are having. So it's just by purely formal, the notion of law itself should imply that you behave ethically. Whereas I don't know why Scheler just calls it non-formalism as opposed to content, focusing on the content of the personality, right? So anything that has to do with the sentimentalism that is really our whole topic of our arc here, of feeling moral sentiments, feeling the content of experience, that somehow this can teach you, it can call you to be ethical, it can teach you ethics, whereas for Kant, we can't base any ethics on empirical matters, because that would just be a matter of like, well, do I happen to feel strongly toward this person? Oh, okay, then I will behave ethically toward them. But when the sentiment is absent, you still want the rule to be there. And we saw even in our last reading here on Schopenhauer that he felt like, yes, well, you actually need both. It should be founded, and I think this is what Adam Smith says too, founded on a sentiment for the individual, but then you need to generalize that and come up with rules so that you are bringing in your principles, your reason to apply it even when you don't feel it at that moment. So it seems like you can bootstrap contra Kant. You can bootstrap up from a non-formal system to actually having a full ethics with rules and not just an ethics of whim, if that can be called ethics.
Yeah. Yeah, we should say that, right? Yeah. So personality will have to mean, like as you said, something like a black box. It can't mean what we mean ordinarily by personality. That's why I was calling it calling it personhood in the Scheler, in our PL Scheler episode. And so, right, we associate personality with possession of certain concrete traits, and so, right, and so we can love those particular things about people. We could love a particular personality and not so much love another personality. But I think this this concept of personhood is very abstract, or it's the kind of numerically individual subjectivity, the thing that Scheler thinks we can't have access to, even when we're successfully empathizing with a person. We can't get into their mind and experience their experiences. So everything that lies within that impenetrable boundary is what constitutes a person's personality or personhood, or maybe today it would just be called subjectivity.
Mm-hmm.
But I think hopefully we'll get a clearer idea from this reading of what it really means.
Okay, and just to for the little business stuff, again, if you could be hearing this in a variety of places, the public feed for this is at closereadsphilosophy.com. If you're listening through there, or through the signing up at the Apple Podcasts or whatever URL from that, then you're going to hear an ad in a second. We actually make these, all the episodes that are public on that, we also make public on our Patreon page, patreon.com/closereadsphilosophy. So if you just follow us, you don't have to give us any money. You'll get all those, but with no ads. So, and that actually also lets you sync it up with Spotify, so you could listen through Spotify. So you might want to do that. And then while you're there, I assume, unless this is a terrible reading, that we will do more than one discussion on it, and the part 2 will always be hidden from the public, but it is available for people that actually pay us a little money through patreon.com/closereadsphilosophy, or perhaps you're hearing this on the Partially Examined Life Patreon feed, in which case you just have to upgrade your membership from $5 to $10, and you'll get all the part 2s and part 3s, etc. Let's go. It is Chapter 6, Formalism and Person. Please proceed, Wes.
One of the basic claims of formal ethics, especially Kant's ethics, is that it alone can confer upon the person a dignity which is beyond any price. On the other hand, formal ethics claims that all non-formal ethics destroy the dignity of the person and his self-value, which cannot be derived from anything. It is easy to see that this claim is true for all ethics of good and purposes.
Goods. Yep.
Goods and purposes. Yeah, I was getting confused there. Every endeavor to measure the goodness of the person in terms of the degree to which his accomplishments support an existing world of goods, including even holy goods, as well as every endeavor to measure the goodness of the person in terms of the accomplishments of his will and actions, as the means of realizing a purpose, even if this be a wholly final purpose which is immanent in the world, contradicts the aforementioned law of preference, according to which values of the person are the highest of all values. But it is another matter to ask whether a formalistic and rational ethics of laws does not also degrade the person, although in a different manner from that of the ethics of goods and purposes, by virtue of which its subordination of the person to an impersonal nomos, under whose domination he can only become a person only through obedience. Yeah, so this is the typical dilemma, and this kind of mirrors the beginning of Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, where Kant will attack Aristotelian eudaimonism and say, yeah, we can't really reduce ethics to the concept of happiness, and we don't want our comportment to other people to be conditional, right? To be based on whether they're good. This is what I think, the eudaimonism is basically, and virtue ethics are perhaps equivalent to what he calls the ethics of goods and purposes, and probably utilitarianism. You can throw that in there as well.
Utilitarianism, I think, is goods. Purposes, at least, is the way, right? Aristotle starts out. What is the final end that we're all working toward? What end does the telos of the human as an animal, human as a distinctive animal, aim at?
So what's at stake is the good, and in utilitarianism, it's the good of the community or the highest number or something like that. In virtue ethics, it's about the individual good, about happiness. And then, as we saw with Mill, you can kind of combine those in certain ways and talk about the good of the many in terms of individual goods, and also even try to derive rights and more typically Kantian ideas out of the concept of the good. But anyway, here, yeah, he's just setting up this dilemma, and this is why Kantian deontology exists in the first place.
Before undertaking a separate examination of what a person is and the meaning that is to be attributed to the person in ethics, it is necessary to determine precisely the place that the person occupies in the formalistic systematic, and after that, the relation of the person thus conceived to moral values within formalism. So then we move to section A, on the theoretical question of the person in general. Number 1, person and reason. It is no yeah. I'll just keep going. It was very
Go
short.
ahead.
It is no terminological accident that formal ethics designate the person first as rational person. This expression does not mean that it belongs essentially to the nature of the person to execute acts which, independent of all causality, follow ideal laws of meaning and states of affairs, logic, ethics, etc. Rather, with this one expression, formalism reveals its implicit material assumption that the person is basically nothing but a logical subject of rational acts, i.e., acts that follow these ideal laws. Or, in a word, the person is the X of some kind of rational activity. The moral person, therefore, the X of volitional activity conforming to the moral law. Instead of first showing what the essence of the person with its special unity consists in, and then demonstrating that rational activity belongs to this essence, it is assumed that the being of the person is nothing but, and exhausts itself in, a point of departure, some x of a lawful rational will, or a practical rational activity. Whatever a being called a person, for example, a certain human being, or even the person of God, may be beyond this point of departure, quote, point of departure of lawful rational acts, unquote, cannot serve as a foundation for the being of the person. Indeed, anything beyond this would restrict or even relatively destroy the being of persons.
All right. So we should start out by saying that this type of argument, which you see, I think, frequently in contemporary continental philosophy, is not the same sort of straw man, because he's not accusing people like Kant or Descartes of thinking that there's nothing but a rational cogito or something like that, and that they don't think concrete persons with their character and psychology and their empirical component don't exist. He's not criticizing them for reducing persons to nothing but logical subjects and their rational acts. But for the purposes of morality, the person, as he's right technically interested in it, in the sense of abstract personhood that we talked about, is precisely the rational person, and it's the rational person for a lot of different reasons. One of them is just that it's the reason responsive person, right? Kant and other figures like Leibniz, they don't want to reduce, if there is such a thing as freedom, which is required for morality, then it can't be the case that we're simply subject to causal laws, that we're being yoked around by objects outside of us, that things are just, impinging on us like as if we were billiard balls, and then we do whatever we're commanded to do by nature. We must be subject to laws, because it can't just be completely arbitrary. So Kant tries to retrieve freedom out of our following our own laws, but there still must be a law. So we're following the law of reason. And, you can see how we do that in deliberation. If we're freely deliberating about something and we come to a conclusion that we should do X, then that deliberation is a rational process, and we've followed the rules of reason or logic in arriving there, in contrast to simply having a desire impulse and then following the impulse.
Right. So we know from discussing Kant before that when someone is worthy of my respect because they are a member of the moral community, and all the problems that we then have with what is our obligation to animals, what is our obligation to the environment. We know that Scheler wants to include love of God, duty toward God somehow in there. So there have to be beings that can't respect you back, that you still have to respect. So I'm not sure if that's exactly on point here, since he is talking about persons, and presumably this is we didn't read the first half of the book, but yeah, we don't know exactly whether person is going to be the only source, as for Kant, of moral obligation, I believe. Right? Is that true for Kant? I mean, certainly it doesn't sound like the second formulation of the categorical imperative explicitly refers to people, right? Treat everybody as an end in themselves. The first version of the categorical imperative seems to be without object, right? Act only such that your maxim could be a universal law. Well, what is a universal law? It means it applies to other people, but it seems like it would still allow for there to be duties that do not, that certainly can refer only to yourself. We know that was a thing with Kant, respect your own personhood. Don't commit suicide. But could there be duties, if you're the only one? Yeah, I guess duties of dignity. I'm just trying to think, like, everybody else is dead.
Yeah.
Are you responsible? Do you have to do anything in particular? Well, yes.
Well, it's got
your own dignity.
It's got to lead to a contradiction of will, right? Mm-hmm. You've got to be essentially willing a thing and its opposite. That's what the universal maxim is designed to root out. So if I'm universally willing lying, and then I do the maxim and I end up in a world where everyone lies and therefore lying is ineffective, I've essentially willed lying and willed not lying at the same time. I've willed a contradiction, and that's the irrational part of it. So, can you get those contradictions without appealing to a world of persons? I don't think that you can. It'd be something to think about, but because the contradiction usually arises from other people engaging in the same immoral act that you're engaging in, and therefore undermining it. It's really just a tweaked out version of the golden rule. So, and the golden rule requires others. But
Yes.
towards the end, towards the end of this paragraph, he's criticizing Kantians for just assuming that personhood has this rational essence, and I think he's going to want to say it. There's something about love there, so they assume it instead of proving it. And then what's this point about God that he's making?
Whenever a being called a person, for example, a certain human being, or even the person of God, may be beyond this point of departure for a lawful rational act cannot serve as a foundation for the being of the person. Is this according to Kant's view?
A certain human being may be beyond this point of departure of lawful rational acts.
Well, just looking
I don't
back,
quite
right?
understand what this means. Yeah.
Instead of first showing what the essence of the person is in its special unity, and then demonstrating that rational activity belongs to this essence, Kant assumes that the being of the person is nothing but and exhausts itself in a point of departure, some X of a lawful rational will, of practical rational activity. Right. Okay. So, yes, according to Kant's view, anything beyond that, in other words, like our universal soul, our immortal, we know he's a Christian. So he wants to give, and so is Kant, but Kant still wants to say, for ethical purposes, practical reason, right? The soul is an unknowable, right? We're leaving room for faith, but uh, we can't literally base ethics on a faith-based conception of the other's valuable soul that we need to respect at all costs. So that is what the soul would be, something beyond the point of departure of merely a generator of rational actions according to lawful maxims.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so that seems to suggest Kant rejects the need for substance dualism in the Cartesian sense for practical purposes. We actually can bracket that phenomenologically for Kant, because we can't know it. He does, he does suggest though that if this world of noumena exists and human souls or as substances are among them, then they could be the origins of uncaused causes, right? In this more folk sense of free will. So, so it's this weird view, right, where the empirical phenomenal world is separate from the noumenal world, but somehow noumenal subjects can kind of dip into and cause things to happen in the empirical world. I guess there's some controversy about that, but here I think the point is we can bracket that out, and that's not the main thing. The main thing is more of an internalist criterion, right? We can think of that the position I just described as an externalist conception of the will and freedom of the will, but an internalist conception just appeals to the concept of rationality and the maxim, something like that.
As the following will show, one thing in this definition is entirely correct. Namely, the person must never be considered a thing or a substance with faculties and powers, among which the faculty or power of reason, etc., is one. The person is rather the immediately co-experienced unity of experiencing. The person is not merely a thought thing behind and outside what is immediately experienced.
Yeah, so this is what I just said. We have an internalist criterion of a person as opposed to personhood as substance. The internalist criterion is this unity, this internal unity. All right. Apart
Well,
from this, however, the above definition of the person as rational leads first to the consequence that every concretization of the idea of the person in a concrete person coincides at once with a depersonalization. For that which is here called person, namely that something which is the subject of rational activity, must be attributed to concrete persons. Indeed, to all men, in the same way and as something identical in all men. Hence, men are not distinguishable by virtue of their personal being alone. Indeed, the concept of an individual person becomes, strictly speaking, a contradictio and an adjecto. For rational acts, themselves defined merely as acts corresponding to a certain lawfulness of states of affairs, are ipso extra individual, or, as many followers of critical philosophy say, supra individual. Any individually determining factors that might be added to the idea of the subject of these acts would necessarily do away with the personal nature of the being concerned. This consequence is, however, in contradiction to the essential interconnection that every finite person is an individual as a person himself. He is not an individual by virtue of his special outer or inner contents of experience, that is, what he thinks, wills, feels, etc., or by virtue of the lived body, its spatial extensions, etc., that he possesses. In other words, the being of the person is never exhausted in being a subject of rational acts of a certain lawfulness, no matter how his being must otherwise be more precisely conceived, and no matter how wrong it is to conceive of this being as a thing or substance. The person could not even be obedient to the moral law if, as its executor, he were created, as it were, by this law. For the being of the person is also the foundation of any obedience. And then there's a footnote there. Let's not get into that right now. Maybe we can read it later. But all right, there's a lot here.
right. It seems to
Um,
come down to I didn't read the Sterner, but somebody was commenting on the Sterner that picking out yourself as an individual is like the Tao. You cannot speak it, right? Because if you say, I am this bundle of qualities or something, well, no, it's not as specific as that. What makes, and certainly what makes you considered a person for ethical purposes is not some bundle of qualities. Uh, right. So can you even say, the personhood is, as you've been saying, like what is Feuerbach's way of putting it? The species being. That's sorry, that's the term I was looking
mhm.
for. Right. So it seems like it is your participation in personhood, but that doesn't pick you out as an individual. So what is it? We're supposed to respect you as an individual, but I can't actually name. I can't say why or say anything about it without picking out something that's not you as an individual.
Right. So in this sense, he's reprising the criticism of Kant, I think, originally made by Fichte, which is that, yeah, if we're simply talking about a rational or transcendental ego, then we might as well be talking about one big ego, one big rational ego that stands behind everything, because it can't be individuated. There's nothing, right, that individuates one rational ego from another, which I think is what you were just saying. It's something identical in all men. This is why he's referencing the critical philosophy, which is basically German idealism. So it's that, and it's eo ipso extra individual or supra individual, which is to say, it ultimately becomes God, or spirit in Hegel. So that does away with the personal nature of an individual person. So yeah, we have a real paradox here because we don't, right? We understand that the empirical person, whether it's his body or his individual personal identity, his character, those things can't be the basis of morality. But if we do away with them, what is going to individuate one person from another? That becomes kind of a mystery. But whatever the case, yeah, he wants to say that the being of a person, even if we're not going to treat it right in terms of a concrete body or a substance ontology or anything like that, can't just be rational acts. We need some other individuating property.
Keep going.
If one fixes his attention on the above erroneous definition, Kant unfortunately did not do so. The result is an ethics. Sorry. Okay. Fortunately, okay. Okay, why is it fortunate? Kant fortunately did not do so. The result is an ethics that leads to anything but the recognition of the so-called autonomy or dignity of the person qua person. Okay. What must follow from this definition is not autonomy, a term in which auto is supposed to point to the independence of the person, but logonomy, and at the same time, extreme heteronomy of the person. This consequence has been drawn from the Kantian conception of the person by Fichte, and to a greater extent by Hegel. For with both Fichte and Hegel, the person becomes in the end an indifferent thoroughfare for an impersonal, rational activity. The results here are the same with Averroes and Spinoza, despite their different points of departure, whether it be the contingent content of experience or the body, which is to individualize the superpersonal and superindividual rational activity as a person. So this is, yeah, he's kind of getting at some of the things that I just explained, but he, what he wants to say here is that if we just, right, if we're going to say that the rational actor is this impersonal God figure and who acts through these individuated concrete persons, then how do we get autonomy out of that? Don't we just have heteronomy, right? Which is the way Kant describes not being free, but being subject to impulses, being part of a deterministic, naturalistic picture.
So what I got out of that is we have to read some Averroes, because it doesn't seem like Spinoza. I understand it's not insofar as we act. I believe for Spinoza that we are one. It's insofar as we contemplate the eternal truths of reason, which is not actually that different from Plato and Plotinus. So if Averroes is just participating in that tradition, then what are we really getting here? But in none of those, I'm trying to think. I was trying to think how much to what degree this applies to ethics, because I don't actually remember for Spinoza. Obviously, his book is called The Ethics, but it seemed right. Is Spinoza anticipating Kant in the idea of, insofar as we have desires that would put us in conflict with others, then that's heteronomy of the will. And if we are perfectly rational, I mean, certainly for Plato, we're then turned toward the form of the good. And what do? Well, for Plato, it seems like we just contemplate it all day. But for an actual ethicist, it means we go out in the world with the good in our hearts, with love in our hearts, with respect in our hearts, however this translates, and act accordingly. Are we then acting as if God is acting through us? Like, I don't remember Spinoza being so fancy about it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But I do want to say I don't agree that logonomy is at the same time extreme heteronomy. I think if there's any hope for some compatibilist conception of free will, it lies in logonomy, because it's, again, it's reason responsive. So to give an example, and this is kind of a variation on an example that Kant gives in the groundwork. If we, right, if I if I do a calculation like 2 + 2 = 4, and someone asks me, well, how did that come about? and you could say it's heteronymous in the sense it's all just reducible to brain activity, right? I was determined to do that. My brain was determined to function in a certain way as to yield that calculation. But if I'm logonymous, I'm drawn to that conclusion because it's true and I'm sensitive to the truth of it, and because I know how to calculate and I know something about numbers. And so you could say, well, aren't you just constrained by those rational laws in the same way as you'd be constrained by anything? And the whole point of this particular compatibilist conception of free will, I don't think it's the one that's necessarily popular today, but this is the one that appeals to me, is that being bound by our insights into the world, being bound by our rationality, is not truly being bound in the same way as being bound by our impulses or being naturalistic objects, because there's a subjective component where I have real insight into the world and or into the rational world in the case of mathematics, and then act on that insight or make a decision based on that insight. And that's the best thing we can do for freedom. So I really buy into this distinction between logonomy and heteronomy. Now, part of Kant's trick is to say, well, we're issuing our own rational laws. They come from us. So he's trying to reinforce this idea that subjection to the rational law is not unfreedom, that there's still freedom in it. But I don't think we need to even go that far as Kant went to kind of make this argument that there's a kind of freedom and rationality, even if it means being subject to rational laws.
Yes, I can see why someone like Stirner would say this is heteronomy of the, it is my will obeying. Obeying a law of reason or a law of the state. It's something foreign that is being imposed. But Plato's already given the response to that many years ago. Like, well, what is the alternative? It means you're obeying your whims, your desires, and is that really the thing that you want to identify with and so consider yourself free when you're acting according to whim, or do you want to identify with the laws of reason, what you actually should be doing, your better self, let's call it that, and thereby being free when you obey that and being bound when you it seems that that is something irreducibly flexible in the way that we can choose to identify, place our center of value in various things, and this determines what we would call free. It's free. I want to obey the cult leader. I've put my freedom, identify with the cult leader, and therefore everything he commands me to do is actually a free act on my part.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like, yeah, we're gonna the task here seems to be to cash out a sense of freedom involving love, which sounds in line with the Hegelian project, right? From what we read of Hegel, not wanting, right, Jesus's love versus the law following of the Pharisees or something like that, and perhaps with knowledge of the absolute, right? So we're getting elements of the romantic influence on Hegel here as well, where it's like, hey man, can't all be about rationality. We need love. That kind of sentiment. But it'll be really interesting to see if Scheler has something to add to that tradition. Is there a solid argument? I'm completely guessing here about love, just based on what we read. Maybe it's going to go a different direction, but
If one does not hold strictly to the consequence of this definition, what is the definition?
the definition of a person as just a rational.
Yes, the erroneous definition. Okay. If one does not hold strictly to the consequence of this definition, but mixes some positive non-formal element in with the application of the concept of the person, that is, some element which goes beyond the mere acts of rational activity, then there can no longer be any limit to the determination of what in man is to share in autonomy and dignity, or what is to share in this inviolability and esteem. Indeed, no strict limit on the blink of his eyes or any whimsical change in his moods. Thus what is the Greek term here?
Oh, sorry. That's the proton pseudos, the first falsehood.
Okay. Yes.
Um,
Thus the first falsehood in the definition of the person leads to a false alternative. There is either heteronomy of the person through a pure logonomy, and indeed the tendency to complete depersonalization, or the ethical individualism of living one's life without any inner limits on its right. But the recognition of a spiritual person and individuality, which alone can prevent such mistakes, is at once completely precluded by this system of concepts.
all right. He's still giving us a promise, which he hasn't delivered on, which
Yeah.
is how is he going to give us subject, with dignity and autonomy without appealing to the super individual rational, what turns out to be a super individual rational actor acting through us or to our obedience to this alien law. He wants something less depersonalized. So, spiritual person and individuality. I take the spiritual person to be the this rational actor we've been talking about, and then individuality, concreteness is somehow what we're going to add to that. Um, it is true that in Kant's case, the idea of the person acquires the appearance of an existence and full-bloodedness that transcends the X of a rational will through his identification of this X with the homo noumenon, with man as a thing in itself, which he opposes to the homo phenomenon. But logically, the homo noumenon is nothing but the concept of the unknowable constant thing in itself applied to man. The same unknowable constant also pertains, without any inner possibility of differentiation, to every plant and every rock. How could this constant render man a dignity different from that of a rock? All right, so I think he's saying something I already thought he had already said, which is a or maybe I said it. I can't remember anymore. But appeal to noumena, appeal to a substance ontology here as grounding personhood is not going to cut it either, because noumena don't just ground subjects, they ground anything that we want to call a thing in the world. It's hard to see how dignity arises out of that.
I think I want to read footnote 4 here because you started talking about freedom. With freedom, things are somewhat different. The third antinomy is supposed to demonstrate only the legal theoretical possibility of freedom in the sphere of the thing in itself, in the negative sense of uncaused activity. In other words, we can't say for sure that, in fact, we can't even understand how the soul as a thing in itself could cause things in the material world. That makes no sense to us. The notion of cause cannot be extended to things in
Yeah.
themselves.
This is what I was describing before as this legal theoretical possibility of freedom as
Yes.
opposed to compatibilism, which doesn't require it. This is a tension within Kant, where the noumenal subject dips down into the empirical world
Yeah.
and is an uncaused cause. Yeah.
So
Right.
yes, by saying there's a legal theoretical possibility, it's just seeing that because of the limits of on pure reason, we can't rule it out. So faith or practical necessity, practical reason is really what comes in
Hmm.
and fills the gaps. We have to assume that we are responsible for our actions. We have to assume other people are responsible. We couldn't get along in the world without that. But the fact that man and not a rock as a thing in itself is free is supposed to be given through the moral law as a categorical. You ought by way of a postulate. You can, for you ought. But a number of other known contradictions result from the identification of this possible freedom, which man shares with the rock, and the postulated one, positive freedom. For the conceptual range of being free coincides with the being good or the legal character of the will, whereas freedom in the first transcendental sense is freedom to do evil or good, which is a presupposition of the moral relevance of acting in general. It is well known that Fichte developed the first of these Kantian concepts of freedom, and Schopenhauer the second in his theory of the intelligible, innate, basic character of man. Both Kantian concepts of freedom are thoroughly untenable. It was shown above that the famous "you can for you ought" is in conflict with an evidential essential law, and
All
he's
right.
going to
So
refer to elsewhere in the book. All right, so that's a lot of
so
confusing stuff thrown in there.
Well, yeah, the whole thing with Schopenhauer, and we got into it a little bit in our episode on the world as will and representation, but he has this weird kind of account of how the noumena dip into empirical reality to be uncaused causes. And that's this idea of intelligible, innate, basic character, which we don't really need to go into. And then the so again, as I was saying, you have what he's saying here is that there are these two different conceptions of freedom that are actually in tension. One of them I've been calling compatibilist and reason responsive. And you don't need noumena in that picture, right? The whole point is that you're free, I strangely enough, paradoxically, by following the law as long as it's a rational law. And it just doesn't like the noumena are not relevant to that picture on my view, and I think on Scheller's view. And then the other one is this metaphysical concern. Well, if I'm going to be free, I need uncaused causes in the noumena. And he's saying that neither of these pictures is actually going to be sufficient. And yeah, I'm still waiting for a different picture. It'll be interesting.
So I've been looking forward. This whole second section we're about to start, person and the ego of transcendental apperception, is still talking about Kant. I was hoping we would get past Kant and actually get to Scheller's positive theory. We might have to. I definitely want to do a part two of this. Are you in agreement? You're enjoying this enough?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. But whether
Let's
it's
keep
the
reading
part
this
right after
section.
this or whether we want to skip further down to get to the meat of it somehow. But yes, let's keep going for the moment. Please
Yeah,
read.
there's 4 words in this title that excite me: person, ego, transcendental, and apperception. That's why I'm into philosophy. All of those
Well, I
things.
prefer the and, and the of.
Kant holds that the primordial condition of every objective unity of experience, and therewith of the idea of an object in general, as well as the inner psychic and outer physical object, and we may add, of the ideal object, is an I think, the apperception, right, which must accompany every act of perception, representation, etc. I just want to say here, I don't think Kant says must accompany, must be able to accompany. That's an important distinction. That is, this ego is not a correlate that is added to the unity of the object. Its unity and identity constitute the condition of the unity and identity of the object.
So,
Object here means, yeah.
so I don't think experientially we always are thinking of the self whenever we think of, have any cogito, but it is one of the transcendental conditions, the unity of self, of thoughts in a stream of consciousness that is the self. I think that is one of the things. So just like we can say that causality is always there, space and time. Oh yeah, time, since that applies to inner sense as well, that is always a factor, even if we're not thinking explicitly of time.
Yeah, and this is a big subject in phenomenology. Does self-consciousness always mean that I'm making this reference, this conscious reference to the self? And does experience in the human sense require self-consciousness? So I recommend this book by Dan Zahavi called Self and Other: Exploring Subjectivity, Empathy, and Shame. And he's a kind of Schellerian phenomenologist.
Huh.
And yeah, so he's one of the people reviving Scheller's point of view on empathy. A large part of that book is actually about empathy. And
Should we
I,
do that
I,
after Stein?
if you want to, he goes on shows. I heard a great discussion with him on a podcast. Um, but he, so I think some contemporary phenomenologists have this idea that, um, we can have this apperception, which is just doesn't have to make this explicit reference to an I. In fact, even animals have it. It's just an awareness, even at some implicit, tacit level, that one's experience is one's own experience and not the experience of another. I don't know. I don't have a good way of explaining this on the fly, but I find it very plausible. So, so yeah, I apperception and I think can be quite subtle. They don't have to be this explicit reference. And even Kant, if I'm remembering correctly, right, says the I think must be able to accompany every act of perception. So in other words, it could be implicit in it, and then we might not be paying it. Obviously, our experience is unified, and we're not right putting anything into words, and we're not very explicitly thinking of ourselves. Um, but if we pay attention, then we must be able to connect an I to it. And I think Kant is careful there because he understands this problem.
So I think where Scheler is going here is that according to his own theory, and we just got this in starting to read Edith Stein in her description of Scheler, which is again sort of referring to this thing that in Scheler that I said was in the introduction of the book that we read, but we did not find it in the book itself. I'm not necessarily finding, maybe it's going to come in here eventually. He also refers to this, she refers to this on the idols of, sorry, let me pull the idols of self-knowledge. I was just looking through that before here, which is sort of a, let's do the idea of the idols is from Bacon, that he had these idols of what you're trying to do science, and here's what distorts things. Well, if you're trying to describe your inner sense, if you're trying to do phenomenology, here are things that likewise distort things. So it's sort of his. I think when we do our Brentano psychology episode, we might want to return to Scheler about this. But one of the things, according to Stein, that Scheler thinks is that the I does not always accompany these things. In fact, we've seen a little bit in the sympathy book that you can have been infected by someone else's thoughts. Basically, you could have traditions, you could have attitudes from your parents, from your society. And is it true that whenever you think one of these thoughts, you are really associating it with an I, or should you even be? Because according to Scheler, it takes time, it takes maturity to assert your individuality and free yourself from merely these infections that you've gotten from others. So there could be something phenomenologically where as children, at least, this was the story in the intro to the book that I had quoted in that episode, we start out by just having thoughts that are not necessarily attributed to me or you, that actually me and you and they are all sort of undifferentiated, and then we sort of figure out, oh, these are my thoughts. I'm going to actually cut myself off. So it's sort of like I was comparing it to Hegel's story of individuation, that we start out in this herd-like mass, and then through a reciprocal reflection, it's maybe Scheler doesn't have the same story as Hegel, that he's going to say that somehow it's just a natural process that we individuate ourselves. And so, yes, we will see as mature adults, all of our thoughts, all of our cogito are going to be accompanied by the implicit I.
Mm. All right, I think you left off at object here means.
Object here means only a something that is identified through the ego. Identity is not, as it is for us, an essential characteristic of the object, a characteristic that would be intuitable as such in any object, the intuitive basis of the law of identity, A equals A. Rather, the meaning of the term object supposedly coincides with the identification of something through an ego. Hence, identity is originally in the ego, and it is from the ego that the identity of an object is borrowed.
So the point here is that Kant's view is that we take a manifold, we take chaotic sense data, and we construct unified objects out of them, objects as appearances, right? Objects as part of our own constructed world. And that unity is derivative of the unity of the ego. It's derivative of this I think. And the reason why it's derivative, Kant gives all these little mechanisms like the synthesis of the imagination. There are lots of aspects of personal identity which have to collect up the various parts of the manifold and unify it if our identity is to remain the same, right? If I'm to remain the same Wes from one moment to the next, then it can't be the case that all the manifold is just disconnected. So, so the unity of experience and unity of personal identity go very strongly together. And in this case, he wants to say, yeah, it's not. We're not Platonists, right? Kant didn't like rational intuition. We're not intuiting the unity of a particular empirical object from the outside. We're not taking it in from the outside. We are supplying that unity through apperception and through construction, so to speak, which has a lot of its own problems. Go with that. How do you avoid relativism? It's a form of idealism, and we're familiar with all the problems that arise.
Right. And to say that the unity of the object is dependent on the unity of the ego, I'm sort of thinking about Hegel's take where which way does the dependence go? It's more just like, well, when you try to think about the unity of the ego, well, then you think about the fact that you have these different experiences over time that seem tied together actually by the contents of consciousness. So it's actually the unity of the ego is dependent on, it is derived from the unity of objects. But if you start by analyzing all these different appearances of the same object, well, what brings those together? Well, you're certainly thought to your thought is brought, by association to the ego. So, it's sort of a yin yang thing. Which one is dependent on which of the other?
Yeah, he makes this point
Oh,
in footnote 5, actually. I'm just looking at
okay.
this. He's making this exact point. The psychological and empirical ego is supposed to have its identity and unity on the basis of the givenness of constancy in space, of matter. But matter
Oh, so
itself
in
is supposed
Kant.
to have,
Okay.
yeah, but matter itself is supposed to have its identity and unity based on the intranscendental ego. Yeah. So it goes both ways. The ego somehow gets its unity out of the unity of experience, but the experience gets its unity out of the unity of the ego. It's kind of a weird. Um, well, sorry, we should make this distinction. The empirical ego, the psychological ego, gets its unity from the unity of objects, but then the unity of objects in turn gets it from the transcendental ego. So it's not
Hmm.
quite this yin yang or circular, quite a
Okay.
circular thing here. Yeah. Okay.
According to what we found earlier, such a condition does not exist. True, essentially identical objects must correspond to essentially identical acts. But this interconnection, like that between act and object in general, is not a unilateral, but a mutual one. For the ego itself is still an object, not only the individual ego, but what corresponds to the idea of the ego-like manifold and unity called the ego. In contrast to the manifold of the spatio-temporal extensionality of intuition. But an act is never an object. For according to the nature of the being of acts, they are experienced only in their execution and are given in reflection. Hence, an act can never become an object through a second act or a retrospective act of sorts. For an act is not an object even in reflection, which alone makes an act knowable beyond its naive execution. Reflective knowing accompanies an act, but does not objectify it. Okay? Therefore, an act can never be given in any form of perception or even observation, be it outer or inner perception. Nevertheless, every ego is given in the form of only one kind of perception, namely the act form of inner perception, in the form of the manifold corresponding to it by essential law. If we reduce these differences of forms of perception and the intuitive form correlates of their manifolds to an act of formless intuition, quote, the, unquote, ego functioning in the execution of an act of inner perception as a determinate direction of perception as act, only as the form of perception, remains a definite content of perception, but not, as Kant believes, the mere idea of the object or the idea of a logical subject in the form of temporal intuition. Ugh.
Yeah, we're running out of time, and this is
Yeah.
going to take a while to break down. So, yeah, maybe we should just be prepared to go through it in chunks in the next recording.
Well, let's look at right an act. Do we think that it is true an act? I didn't know this was a thing for Kant. and I've never heard this statement in general about phenomenology. I don't think. Maybe I a little bit in Sartre, right? That is, when you reflect on experience, you sort of ruin it, right? Because you add the act of reflection to it. So the way that is you can actually never make an act an object of inner sense, which is blatantly something that, Hume or other folks would just deny. That, like, of course you can. That's what the way, right? That's what Descartes, that's the way introspection works. Granted, we are never, yeah, sure, I'm changing it a little bit, or hey, I'm remembering, I think of an elephant and then I remember just a split, a quarter of a second ago, how I was remembering an elephant. Can I analyze that act? Can I make that act an object? I'm not sure why you couldn't. I mean, insofar as you could make anything an object.
Yeah,
As
not sure.
All right, so we'll start with this point next time, and presumably, yes, at least have one more going, just continuing right from here. I see this section 2 is quite lengthy, and we can decide from there whether we want to abort or skip ahead or continue. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, Wes.